in the heart of the ancient city of Aeloria, where the echoes of forgotten legends still whisper through the stone streets, a young man named Kael stands at the edge of a destiny he never wanted. The Heart of Eternity, a sacred artifact older than memory itself, has been stolen by a shadowy cult. Its power, if unleashed, could unravel the very threads of time, leaving the world in chaos. Kael, the last of the Undying Keepers, is now the only one who can stop it. But can a reluctant guardian, burdened by the weight of his lineage and the fear of failure, rise to the challenge, or will the trials ahead prove too much for him to bear? Where are you joining us from, and what time is it there? Let's step into Kael's world together as we uncover the story of courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding spirit of the Undying Keepers. The ruins of the Temple of Ages loomed before Kael, their ancient stones weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Once a sanctuary of wisdom and peace, the temple now stood as a hollow shell, its grandeur reduced to crumbling walls and cracked pillars. Kael stepped cautiously through the debris, his senses alert. This was where the artifact had last been seen, and if the whispers were true, it might still be hidden somewhere within these ruins. But as he ventured deeper, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, boots crunching against gravel. He wasn't alone. Emerging from the shadows, a group of mercenaries surrounded him, their weapons drawn. Their eyes gleamed with malice, and it was clear they weren't here to talk. Kael's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his blade as one of the mercenaries sneered, "You're too late, Keeper. The artifact is already spoken for." Without another word, the skirmish began. Kael moved with precision, his training as a keeper giving him the edge he needed. One by one, the mercenaries fell, their weapons clattering to the ground. But as the last one slumped to his knees, he gasped out a final, chilling revelation. Valen sends his regards. The name struck Kael like a thunderbolt. Valen, a name he hadn't heard in years. Once a fellow keeper, Valen had been a guardian of history, sworn to protect the balance of time. But something had changed him, something had twisted his purpose. Now it seemed, Valen had become the architect of chaos, leading a cult bent on rewriting history itself. The realization left Kael reeling. How could someone who had once stood beside him, who had shared the same sacred vows, now be his greatest adversary? The betrayal cut deeper than any blade, yet amidst the shock, a fire ignited within Kael. He couldn't afford to falter. Valen's plans were no longer just a threat to the Keepers. They were a threat to the very fabric of existence. If the cult succeeded in altering the past, the consequences would be catastrophic. Entire civilizations could vanish, and the future would be rewritten in ways no one could predict. Kael clenched his fists, his resolve solidifying. He would stop Valen, no matter the cost. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. As he stood amidst the ruins, the weight of his mission pressed heavily on his shoulders. But with every step forward, Kael knew he was one step closer to uncovering the truth, and one step closer to stopping the man who had once been his brother in arms. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but Kael was ready. The fate of history itself depended on it. Kael's journey led him to the edge of the Whispering Forest, a place shrouded in legend and mystery. Time itself seemed to bend here, with hours passing like minutes and days, stretching into what felt like weeks. The forest was alive, its towering trees whispering secrets in a language only the wind could translate. It was here, amidst the ancient groves, that Kael hoped to uncover the next piece of the puzzle, a clue to the cult's sinister plans. As he ventured deeper, the air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint hum of unseen energies. It wasn't long before he crossed paths with Lyra, a rogue scholar whose reputation for unraveling ancient mysteries preceded her. Her sharp eyes and quick wit were matched only by her determination to stop the cult at any cost. She had been tracking their movements for months, piecing together fragments of their dark intentions. Their meeting was no coincidence. Lyra had been searching for Kael as much as he had been searching for answers. Together, they uncovered an ancient prophecy etched into the bark of a long-forgotten tree. The words were cryptic, speaking of the heart's true power, a force capable of reshaping reality itself. But the prophecy also carried a warning. Those who sought to wield it would unleash chaos beyond imagination. As they deciphered the text, Kael found himself torn. The Keepers had sworn to protect the heart's secrets at all costs, and sharing even a fragment of that knowledge with Lyra felt like a betrayal. Could he trust her? Or was she another pawn in the cult's ever-expanding game? Their uneasy alliance was put to the test sooner than either expected. Without warning, the forest shifted around them, and time itself seemed to fracture. Strange, time-warped creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms flickering like echoes of a forgotten age. Kael's training as a keeper had prepared him for many things, but this was unlike anything he had faced before. As the creatures closed in, it became clear that Lyra's knowledge of the forest and its anomalies was their only hope. Reluctantly, Kael had no choice but to rely on her, a decision that would either save them or seal their fate. The battle that followed was a blur of chaos and desperation. Lyra's quick thinking and deep understanding of the forest's quirks turned the tide, but it was Kael's raw determination that kept them alive. As the last creature fell, a fragile trust began to form between them. Yet, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers of the forest were not just warnings, they were a call to action. The cult's plans were far more advanced than anyone had realized, and time, in every sense of the word, was running out. As the dust of their journey settled, Kael and Lyra found themselves standing at the edge of Cronos, a city unlike any they had ever seen. Towers of shimmering glass and stone spiraled into the sky, their surfaces pulsating with a faint, golden glow. This was no ordinary metropolis. It was a nexus of temporal energy, where the past, present, and future seemed to intertwine like threads in a vast, invisible tapestry. The air itself hummed with a low, resonant frequency, as if the city itself were alive, whispering secrets of time long forgotten. But beneath its shimmering beauty, Cronos held a darker truth. The cult's presence was unmistakable. Symbols carved into the city's walls, once vibrant and sacred, now bore the mark of corruption. Kael's hand tightened around the heart of eternity, the artifact pulsing faintly in his grip. It was here, in this city of temporal power, that the cult planned to unleash their most dangerous scheme yet, to open a rift to the past and rewrite history itself. The weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on Kael's shoulders. Lyra, ever the optimist, saw opportunity where Kael saw only peril. "If the heart can open a rift," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air, "it could also heal the fractures in time. Restore what's been lost. Isn't that what the keepers are meant to do? Protect and preserve." Her words were logical, hopeful, but Kael's expression darkened. He had seen too much, carried too much, to trust in possibilities. To him, the heart was a weapon, and weapons could only bring destruction. Their debate grew more heated as they moved through the city, weaving through crowds of unsuspecting citizens. Kael argued for destroying the heart, severing the cult's plans before they could take root. "One misstep," he warned, "and we could unravel everything." "The past isn't meant to be rewritten," but Lyra countered with equal fervor. "And what if we could fix what's broken? What if we could undo the damage the cult has already done? Isn't that worth the risk?" The tension between them was palpable, a rift of their own forming as they approached the cult's hidden stronghold. Nestled deep within the city's underbelly, the stronghold was a labyrinth of twisting corridors and shadowed chambers. The air grew colder, the hum of temporal energy replaced by an eerie silence. It was here that their paths diverged, both literally and figuratively. As they infiltrated the cult sanctum, a trap was sprung. In the chaos, Kael and Lyra were separated, each dragged into the darkness by unseen hands. Alone in his cell, Kael's mind raced. The heart of eternity was gone, taken by the cult, and with it, his sense of purpose. He had always been certain of his role as a keeper, to guard, to protect, to prevent catastrophe at all costs. But now, doubt crept in. Had he been too quick to dismiss Lyra's vision? Could the heart truly be used for good, or was it, as he feared, a force too dangerous to wield? The questions gnawed at him, each one chipping away at the certainty that had once defined him. As the minutes stretched into hours, Kael's thoughts turned to Lyra. Where was she? What had become of her? And more importantly, what would become of the world if the cult succeeded? The answers eluded him, lost in the shadows of his cell. But one thing was clear. Time was running out, and the fate of Cronos, the Keepers, and perhaps all of existence, rested on the choices he would soon have to make. The dim glow of the prison cell flickered as Kael stirred, his chains clinking softly against the cold stone floor. Before him stood Valen, his presence both commanding and unsettling. The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension, a storm brewing beneath the surface. Valen's eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto Kael's, and for a moment, the weight of centuries seemed to press down on them both. "You think you're preserving balance," Valen began, his voice low but laced with barely contained emotion. "But all you've done is lock away the possibility of change. My family, my wife, my children were taken from me because of the Keeper's laws. Laws you uphold without question. What good is timelessness if it demands such a price?" Kael's jaw tightened, but he couldn't look away. Valen's words struck a chord, a dissonant note in the symphony of duty he had lived by for so long. The Keeper's mission had always been clear: protect the timeline, no matter the cost. But now, faced with Valen's raw pain, Kael found himself grappling with a question he had never allowed himself to ask. Was their work truly just, or had they become prisoners of their own principles? Before Kael could respond, The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. Valen stepped back, his expression hardening. Think on it, Kael. The heart of eternity could undo it all, every loss, every mistake. But will you cling to your duty, or will you finally see the truth? As Valen disappeared into the shadows, Kael's thoughts raced. The heart's power was undeniable, but so were its dangers. Before he could dwell further, a soft clink broke the silence. The chains around his wrists fell away, and a figure emerged from the darkness, a face Kael hadn't seen in centuries. "You look like you could use a hand," the stranger said, a faint smirk playing on their lips. It was Alara, a keeper thought lost to time, his name whispered only in the annals of their order. His presence was both a relief and a shock. Alara. How? Kael started, but the older keeper cut him off with a raised hand. No time for explanations. Valen's plans are more dangerous than you realize. The heart doesn't just rewrite history, it consumes those who wield it. Even the strongest minds crumble under its influence. Alaric's tone was urgent, his usual calm replaced by a rare intensity. Kael hesitated, the weight of his mission pressing harder than ever. He had always believed in the Keeper's cause, but now doubts gnawed at the edges of his resolve. If the heart could undo so much suffering, was it truly wrong to use it? And yet, Alaric's warning lingered, a shadow over his thoughts. As they made their escape, Kael's mind churned with questions. The cost of preserving time had always been clear, but now he wondered if the price was too high. Valen's pain, Alaric's warnings, the heart's allure, it all wove together into a tapestry of uncertainty. For the first time in centuries, Kael felt the cracks in his unwavering resolve. The mission remained, but the path ahead was no longer as clear as it once seemed. Kael's footsteps echoed through the ancient stone corridors as he approached the dimly lit chamber where Lyra awaited. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint hum of magic, a reminder of the stakes they faced. When their eyes met, Lyra's expression was a mix of urgency and something deeper, something unspoken. She wasted no time, revealing the scroll she had discovered, its ancient runes glowing faintly in the dim light. "This," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion, "is how we stop them. The cult's ritual hinges on a single moment of vulnerability. If we strike then, we can disrupt the rift before it tears this world apart." Kael listened intently, his mind racing. The plan made sense, but something in Lyra's tone gave him pause. She spoke of the ritual with a familiarity that went beyond mere knowledge, and when she mentioned altering the past, her voice faltered. "This isn't just about stopping them, is it?" Kael asked, his gaze searching hers. Lyra hesitated, then nodded. "The rift, it's not just a gateway for them. It's a chance to undo mistakes, to rewrite what's been lost. I've carried this burden for too long, Kael. I need to set it right." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Kael felt the weight of her confession, the unspoken plea for understanding. He realized then that this wasn't just a mission to save the world. It was a test of trust, of loyalty, and of the bonds that tied them together. As they prepared for the final confrontation, Kael found himself reflecting on the choices that had brought them here. Every decision, every sacrifice, rippled out far beyond himself. The people he cared about, the lives intertwined with his own. They all bore the weight of his actions. Lyra's revelation had shifted something in him, forcing him to confront not only the dangers ahead, but the consequences of his own heart. Could he trust her fully, knowing her motives extended beyond the mission, or would doubt fracture the fragile alliance they'd built? The answers weren't clear, but one thing was certain: the path they were about to walk would change everything, for better or worse. And as the shadows deepened around them, Kael steeled himself for the storm to come. The air was thick with an eerie hum as Kael and Lyra approached the crumbling fortress, perched precariously over the swirling maw of a temporal vortex. The cult's ritual site was a place where time itself seemed to fray at the edges, its energies pulsing like a heartbeat gone wild. Every step forward felt heavier, as if the ground itself resisted their advance. Kael tightened his grip on the heart of eternity, its faint glow a reminder of the power he carried and the burden it placed on him. Lyra stayed close, her sharp eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of ambush. They had come too far to turn back now. Inside the fortress, the atmosphere shifted. The walls seemed to breathe, their ancient stones vibrating with the chaotic energies of the vortex below. The cultists' chants echoed through the halls, a haunting melody that seemed to warp the very fabric of reality. And then, there he was, Valen, standing at the center of it all, his presence as commanding as it was chilling. His eyes locked onto Kael, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. "You shouldn't have come," Valen said, his voice cold and final, but Kael knew there was no other choice. The battle erupted in a flash of light and fury. Valen moved with an unnerving precision, his mastery over time allowing him to anticipate every strike, every move Kael made. It was like fighting a shadow. Every time Kael thought he had the upper hand, Valen would slip through his grasp, rewinding moments to evade or counter. The heart of eternity pulsed in Kael's hand, its power surging through him, but even that seemed insufficient against Valen's relentless control. Desperation crept in as Kael realized he was being outmatched. Then, in a moment of reckless resolve, Kael tapped deeper into the heart's power. The energy surged through him like a wildfire, raw and uncontrollable. He could feel its corrupting influence gnawing at the edges of his mind, but he pushed through, using its force to disrupt Valen's temporal manipulations. The clash of their powers sent shockwaves through the fortress, the ground cracking beneath them as the vortex roared to life. Time itself seemed to fracture, splintering into fragments of past, present, and future. The battle ended in a stalemate, both warriors battered and spent, but the damage had been done. The rift above the vortex had been partially opened, its chaotic energies spilling out like a storm unleashed. Kael could feel the weight of what he'd done, what they'd both done. The stakes had escalated far beyond what he'd imagined. The heart's power, once a tool for salvation, now felt like a double-edged sword, its corruption inching closer with every use. As he looked at the swirling chaos above, Kael realized one thing. This was no longer just a fight against Valen or the cult. It was a race against time itself. The air around Kael and Lyra crackled with energy as the temporal rift expanded, its edges shimmering like broken glass against the fabric of reality. Kael's hands trembled as he channeled the heart's raw power, his veins glowing with an eerie, golden light. But the artifact wasn't just a tool. It was a force of its own, and it was beginning to take hold of him. Each surge of energy brought with it a flood of visions, fragmented glimpses of worlds that could have been, lives he might have lived. One vision, sharper than the rest, clawed at his mind, a timeline where he stood beside Valen, his once friend, turned enemy, wielding the heart's power not to save the world, but to dominate it. The image was intoxicating, seductive, and it left Kael reeling. Lyra's voice cut through the chaos, urgent and unwavering. "Kael, you have to destroy it. The heart is consuming you. It's twisting your mind." Her words were a lifeline, but they also carried a weight he wasn't ready to face. Destroying the heart meant losing their only chance to seal the rift, but keeping it risked losing himself entirely. The conflict within him grew, a storm of doubt and fear that mirrored the chaos spreading across the world. Time itself was fracturing, moments splintering into fragments that no longer aligned. In the distance, the sky seemed to fold in on itself, a kaleidoscope of past, present, and future colliding in a disorienting swirl. Kael turned to Lyra, his eyes clouded with uncertainty. "If I destroy it, what happens to us, to the world? We could lose everything." His voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of his words hung heavy between them. Lyra stepped closer, her gaze steady despite the turmoil around them. "We'll find another way, but if we lose you, Kael, there's no hope left. The heart isn't just a weapon, it's a trap. It's using you, and if you let it, it'll tear us apart." Her words struck a chord, but the vision still lingered, whispering promises of power and control. As the rift continued to destabilize, the ground beneath them shifted, time itself bending and warping. A tree nearby aged centuries in seconds, its branches withering to dust before sprouting anew. A flock of birds froze mid-flight, suspended in a moment that no longer belonged to any timeline. The world was unraveling, and Kael stood at the center of it all, torn between the duty he had sworn to uphold and the seductive pull of the heart's power. The bond between him and Lyra, once unshakable, now felt fragile, strained by the weight of his indecision. Each passing moment brought them closer to a breaking point, not just with the rift, but with each other. The heart pulsed in his hands, its rhythm syncopated with his own heartbeat, a constant reminder of the choice he had to make. But time was running out, and the world's fractures were spreading faster than they could contain. The question wasn't just whether Kael could resist the heart's pull, it was whether he could trust himself to make the right decision before it was too late. Kael and Lyra stood at the edge of the whispering abyss, a chasm so deep it seemed to stretch into the very fabric of time itself. The air was thick with the scent of ancient magic, and the faint hum of the rift pulsed beneath their feet like a heartbeat. It was here, in this forgotten place, that they hoped to find the Oracle of Eternity, a being said to hold knowledge older than the stars. As they descended into the abyss, the walls around them shimmered with faint, ghostly light, as if the stone itself remembered the countless souls who had sought wisdom here. The Oracle's chamber was not what they expected. Instead of a grand hall or towering figure, they found a small, unassuming figure, cloaked in shadow, seated on a throne of twisted roots. Its voice was neither male nor female, but a chorus of whispers that seemed to echo from every direction at once. The Oracle spoke of the rift, of the heart's power, and of the price that must be paid to control it. The heart's energy is bound to the threads of time, it said, its voice weaving through the air like a fragile melody. To wield it is to unravel those threads, to undo what has been and what will be. Only one willing to sacrifice their own timeline can hope to seal the rift. Kael felt the weight of those words settle over him like a suffocating shroud. Sacrifice his own timeline. It meant more than death. It meant erasing every memory, every moment, every connection he had ever made. He would cease to exist, not just in the present, but in the past as well. The thought was paralyzing. Lyra's voice broke through the silence, steady but tinged with sorrow. "There has to be another way," she said, her eyes searching the oracle's shadowed form. But the being only shook its head, the motion slow and deliberate. "The cost is absolute," it replied. "The choice is yours." Kael's mind raced. He thought of his childhood, of the friends he had lost, of the world he had sworn to protect as a keeper. Could he really give it all up? The question hung in the air, unanswered. But as he looked at Lyra, at the determination in her eyes, he began to understand the true burden of his duty. Being a keeper wasn't just about guarding the world. It was about being willing to bear the unimaginable to ensure its survival. The revelation was staggering, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. Kael had always known his role was one of sacrifice, but this went beyond anything he had ever imagined. And yet, as the weight of the decision pressed down on him, he found a quiet resolve. The world was worth it. The people he loved were worth it. If this was the price, he would pay it. The oracle's words lingered in the air, a haunting reminder of what lay ahead. But Kael's heart, though heavy, began to steady. He had always been a guardian, a protector. Now he would become something more, a sacrifice, a memory, a silent whisper in the annals of time. The path before him was dark, but he would walk it, not as a hero, but as a keeper, for that was his duty and his destiny. Kael stood at the edge of the rift, the heart of eternity, pulsing in his hands like a living thing. The air around him crackled with raw energy, the very fabric of reality, straining under the weight of the tear between worlds. He had come this far, driven by duty and the hope of redemption. But now, face to face with the enormity of the task, doubt crept in. Could he truly seal the rift? And if he did, what would it cost him? Before he could act, a shadow emerged from the swirling chaos. Valen. His once familiar face was now twisted, his eyes glowing with the heart's corrupted power. The man who had been his brother, his ally, was gone. In his place stood a being of raw ambition, his voice resonating with a chilling certainty. "Kael," Valen began, his tone almost pleading, "you don't have to do this. Join me. Together, we can reshape the world. No more endless cycles of sacrifice. No more chains of duty. Imagine a world free from the Keeper's burdens, free from the weight of eternity." For a moment, Kael hesitated. The offer was tempting, more than he wanted to admit. The thought of liberation, of a world unshackled from the endless demands of the Keepers, flickered in his mind like a forbidden flame. But then he remembered the cost, the lives lost, the trust betrayed. The rift behind Valen pulsed violently, a reminder of the chaos that would follow if he gave in. "No," Kael said, his voice steady despite the storm raging around him. "This isn't freedom, it's destruction, and I won't let you unleash it." Valen's expression darkened, the glow in his eyes intensifying. Then you leave me no choice. As the two clashed, the rift's energy surged, spiraling out of control. The ground beneath them trembled, and the sky above split into jagged streaks of light. Kael knew time was running out. Every second, the rift remained open. The closer it came to consuming everything, not just their world, but every world connected by its chaotic threads. With the heart in his hands, Kael prepared for the unthinkable. To seal the rift, he would have to channel its energy through himself, a sacrifice that would likely cost him his life. The weight of that decision pressed heavily on him, but there was no other way. The Keepers had always sworn to protect the balance, no matter the cost. And now it was his turn to uphold that oath. As the rift's energy swelled, threatening to engulf them all, Kael took a deep breath, steeling himself for what came next. The temptation to join Valen lingered, a whisper in the back of his mind, but he pushed it aside. This was his duty, his choice, and with that, he stepped forward, the heart's light flaring brighter than ever as he faced the rift and the chaos it held. The air crackled with tension as Kael and Valen stood at the edge of the rift, their fates intertwined in a final, desperate clash. The heart of eternity pulsed in Kael's hands, its light flickering like a dying star. Valen's eyes gleamed with malice, his voice dripping with venom as he taunted. "You think you can stop me? You're nothing but a relic of a forgotten age." But Kael's resolve hardened. He had come too far to falter now. The heart's power surged through him, a torrent of energy that countered Valen's dark manipulations, each strike a battle of wills as much as strength. In the chaos, Lyra moved with purpose. Her voice cut through the din, calm yet urgent, as she turned to Kael. "This is it, the moment we've been fighting for. Don't let him win." Before Kael could protest, she stepped forward, her body glowing with a radiant light. With a final, defiant smile, Lyra channeled her essence into the heart, her life force a beacon of hope. Her sacrifice shattered Valen's defenses, buying Kael the precious seconds he needed. As her form dissolved into the ether, Kael felt a surge of grief, and something more. A fire ignited within him, fueled by her memory and the weight of her sacrifice. With a roar, Kael embraced his destiny. The heart's power surged anew, its light engulfing the battlefield. He no longer fought as a man burdened by doubt, but as a true keeper, a guardian of eternity. Valen's laughter turned to screams as the rift shuddered, its dark energy recoiling under the heart's brilliance. Kael's hands trembled as he channeled the last of his strength, sealing the rift with a final, cataclysmic burst of energy. The world around him seemed to hold its breath, the silence deafening as the rift closed. But victory came at a cost. As the light faded, Kael felt a strange emptiness. His hands began to fade, his form dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The heart had demanded everything, not just his strength, but his very existence. He looked down at the fading outline of his body, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. The Keepers had always been more than individuals. They were a legacy, a promise to protect the world, and now Kael understood. His sacrifice ensured that legacy would endure, even as he vanished from the timeline. The world was saved, but Kael's story was over. His final act left behind no monuments, no grand tales, only the quiet certainty that the Undying Keepers would live on. Somewhere in the annals of time, His name would echo as a whisper, a reminder of the price paid for eternity. And as the last traces of Kael faded, the heart of eternity glowed softly, a silent sentinel watching over a world he had given everything to protect. The Keeper's duty was eternal, and Kael had ensured their story would never end. As the threads of time weave themselves back into place, Kael begins to feel the weight of his journey lifting. In flashes, he sees glimpses of the lives he has touched, moments of joy, sorrow, triumph, and healing. Each memory is a fleeting spark, but together they form a tapestry of meaning. Among them, Lyra's face stands out, her laughter echoing in his mind like a melody he had almost forgotten. It's a reminder of the love and connection that made his sacrifices worthwhile. He realizes now that his purpose was never just about guarding time. It was about preserving the humanity within it. The heart of eternity, once a source of boundless power, fades into obscurity. Its light dims, its energy sealed away, as if the universe itself has decided that such power should no longer exist. The world continues its steady march forward, unaware of the silent guardian who stood between it and chaos. People live their lives, their stories unfolding without the shadow of the heart's influence. Kael finds solace in this, a world unburdened by the weight of eternal guardianship, free to chart its own course. In his final moments, Kael's thoughts turn not to regret, but to hope. He imagines a future where the mistakes of the past no longer dictate the present, where the cycle of sacrifice and loss is broken. He sees a world where balance is not maintained by the few, but nurtured by the many. And though his name may fade into legend, his legacy lives on in the lives he touched and the peace he secured. For Kael, the true reward is not immortality, but the knowledge that his actions have given others the chance to live fully, freely, and without fear. As years turned into decades, the tales of Kael and the Undying Keepers became more than just stories. They became legends, whispers of their courage and sacrifice, echoed through the ages, passed down from one generation to the next. And then, as if the universe itself had been waiting, a new generation of keepers began to rise. Among them was a young woman named Alara, whose very presence seemed to carry an air of destiny. Alara's journey began in the crumbling ruins of Aeloria, where time had worn away the grandeur of the ancient city, but not its secrets. While exploring the remnants of a forgotten temple, she stumbled upon fragments of Kael's story, scraps of parchment, etched symbols, and faint inscriptions that spoke of his final stand. As she pieced together these fragments, something stirred within her. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a pull, a connection to something far greater than herself. And then there was her resemblance to Lyra. It wasn't just in her features, it was in the way she carried herself, the quiet determination in her eyes, and the way she seemed to hear the whispers of the past. It was as if the threads of fate had woven her into the very fabric of this ancient tale. Alara couldn't shake the feeling that she was being guided, not by chance, but by an unseen hand. Perhaps it was the spirit of Kael, or the lingering power of the Undying Keepers, calling her to continue what they had begun. The legacy of the Keepers was far from over. In Alara, the flame of their purpose burned anew, hinting at a chapter yet to be written in the eternal struggle between light and shadow. The ruins of Aeloria were no longer just a relic of the past. They were a beacon, a call to action, for those brave enough to answer. And as Alara stood amidst the stones, the weight of history on her shoulders, she knew one thing for certain. The story of the Undying Keepers was far from finished. Alara stepped into the training grounds, the weight of her new role settling heavily on her shoulders. The Keepers' rituals were ancient, their techniques honed over centuries, and yet, as she moved through the motions, her mind wandered. Visions of Kael flickered at the edges of her thoughts, his face, his voice, the haunting echo of the heart of eternity. It was as though the artifact itself was calling to her, pulling her back to the ruins where her journey had begun. One evening, drawn by an inexplicable urge, Alara found herself wandering beneath the crumbling arches of the Keeper's sanctuary. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, leading her to a hidden passage she had never noticed before. The air grew colder as she descended into the shadows, her torchlight revealing walls etched with forgotten symbols. At the end of the passage, she discovered a chamber, untouched by time, filled with relics that seemed to hum with a quiet power. Among the artifacts, her gaze fell on a shard of the heart of eternity. It was small, no larger than her palm, but it pulsed faintly, as though it still carried a sliver of life. Alara's breath caught as she reached out, her fingers trembling. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy coursed through her, and she was flooded with fragmented memories, visions of Kael, not as a fallen hero, but as something more complex, something she couldn't yet understand. This discovery left her with more questions than answers. The Keepers had always spoken of their power as pure and untainted, a force of protection and balance. But the shard suggested something darker, a connection to the very artifact they had sworn to guard against. Could the Keeper's power be intertwined with the heart's energy? And if so, what did that mean for their purpose? More unsettling still, the shard's faint pulse hinted at the possibility that Kael was not truly gone. Was it possible for him to return, or was this simply the lingering echo of his legacy? Alara's training took on a new urgency, her focus sharpened by the weight of her discovery. She couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were hidden in the shadows of the past, waiting to be uncovered. And as she delved deeper, she began to realize that the line between guardian and destroyer was far thinner than she had ever imagined. Alara's journey brought her to the foot of a towering, ancient temple, its stones weathered by countless ages. This was the sanctuary of the Oracle of Eternity, a being said to hold the knowledge of all that was, is, and will be. The air hummed with an otherworldly energy as Alara stepped inside, her heart heavy with the weight of her visions. She had seen Kael not just as a fleeting image, but as a presence that lingered, as if he were still alive in some fragmented way. She needed answers, and the Oracle was her only hope. The Oracle's voice echoed through the chamber, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You seek understanding," it intoned, its words resonating deep within Alara's soul. "But what you ask for is not a simple truth. Kael's sacrifice was not an end. It was a ripple, a temporal echo that defies the natural order. Though his body perished, fragments of his essence persist, scattered across time itself." Alara's breath caught in her throat. How is that possible? "How can I bring him back?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mix of desperation and determination. The Oracle's gaze seemed to pierce through her, ancient and knowing. To restore Kael is to challenge the very fabric of existence. It will require more than strength. It will demand a sacrifice of your own. Are you prepared to walk that path? Without hesitation, Alara nodded. She had already lost so much, but Kael's wisdom was irreplaceable. The world was on the brink of a new threat, one that only he could help her face. The oracle's words lingered in her mind as she left the temple, her resolve stronger than ever. Her next destination was clear, the Whispering Forest, a place where time itself was said to bend and twist, where the echoes of the past and future intertwined. As she entered the forest, the very air seemed to shift around her. The trees whispered secrets in a language she couldn't quite understand, their voices weaving a tapestry of forgotten moments. Alara could feel the pull of time, as if it were a river she could navigate. She moved with purpose, her every step guided by the faint yet unmistakable presence of Kael's essence. The closer she got, the more the forest seemed to respond to her will, the boundaries between past and present blurring with each passing moment. This was no ordinary quest. It was a journey through the very heart of time, a test of her resolve and her connection to the eternal. And as the whispering forest enveloped her, Alara knew one thing for certain. She would not stop until Kael was whole again. The fate of the world depended on it. As Alara ventured deeper into the whispering forest, the air grew thick with an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant murmurs of voices. These weren't the whispers of the forest itself, no. These were the voices of those who had once followed Valen, the fallen guardian. The cult, thought to be disbanded, had risen again, their purpose reshaped by a shadowy new leader. Their goal was clear, to harness the power of the temporal echo, a ripple in time itself, and use it to bring Valen back from oblivion. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Alara found herself at a crossroads. Her first instinct was to prioritize Kael, her fellow guardian, whose fractured spirit desperately needed restoration. But the cult's resurgence posed an immediate threat, one that could unravel the fragile balance of time itself. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her, made even more complicated by the shard of the heart of eternity she carried. Its power, once a source of strength, now pulsed with an unsettling energy, distorting her perception of time. Moments stretched into hours, and hours seemed to collapse into seconds, leaving her disoriented and unsure of her next move. As she moved through the forest, she caught glimpses of the cult's followers' shadowy figures, cloaked in tattered robes, their eyes gleaming with fervor. They chanted in a language that seemed to twist the air around them, their words resonating with the temporal echo. It was as if the forest itself was bending to their will, its ancient magic being twisted into something dark and dangerous. Alara knew she couldn't ignore this threat, but every step toward the cult felt like a step away from Kael, whose presence in her mind grew fainter with each passing moment. The shard's influence only deepened her turmoil. Visions of the past and future overlapped, showing her glimpses of what could be, a world where Valen's resurrection plunged the land into chaos, or one where Kael's absence left the Guardians too weakened to protect it. Each possibility was more harrowing than the last, and Alara realized that her decision wouldn't just shape her own fate, it would determine the fate of everything she held dear. But amidst the chaos, a quiet resolve began to stir within her. She couldn't abandon Kael, not when his light had guided her for so long. Yet, she also couldn't allow the cult to succeed, not when their actions threatened to unravel the very fabric of time. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain. Alara would have to find a way to confront both threats, even if it meant risking everything she had left. The whispering forest held its breath, waiting for her next move, as the fate of the Guardians, and perhaps the world itself, hung in the balance. The air crackled with energy as Alara stepped into the heart of the cult's stronghold, her grip tightening around the shard. Before her stood their leader, a figure shrouded in shadows, their presence radiating an unsettling power. This wasn't just a battle of strength. It was a clash across time itself. With every strike, the world around them flickered, fragments of past, present, and future colliding in a chaotic dance. Alara wielded the shard's power with precision, bending time to her will, but each maneuver came at a cost. The shard pulsed in her hand, its energy seeping into her veins, threatening to overwhelm her. Her vision blurred, her thoughts tangled, and for a moment, she felt as though she might lose herself entirely. Then, in a fleeting moment of clarity, it hit her. This wasn't about bringing Kael back. It never had been. His legacy wasn't in his physical return, but in the wisdom he'd left behind, the lessons etched into her very soul. The shard wasn't a tool for resurrection. It was a chain, binding her to a past she couldn't change. With a deep breath, Alara made her choice. She summoned the last of her strength, channeling the shard's energy not to fight, but to destroy. The glow intensified, and with a resounding crack, the shard shattered, its fragments scattering like stardust. The timeline shuddered, the cult's connection to the temporal echo severed once and for all. Kael's sacrifice remained unbroken, his memory preserved not as a ghost of the past, but as a guiding light for the future. As the echoes of battle faded, Alara stood alone, the weight of her decision settling over her. The shard was gone, but its absence brought a strange sense of peace. She had stepped into the unknown, not to rewrite history, but to honor it. And in that moment, she realized that true power didn't come from controlling time. It came from understanding how to live within its flow. As the dust settled and the echoes of battle faded, Alara stood at the threshold of a new era. The cult that had threatened the very fabric of time was no more, its shadowy influence vanquished by her courage and the sacrifices of those who stood beside her. With a heart heavy yet hopeful, she returned to Aeloria, the city that had once been a beacon of light, but now bore the scars of turmoil. This time, however, she came not as a reluctant hero, but as a keeper, fully embracing the mantle she had once feared. The city itself seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the rebuilding began. Streets once filled with whispers of dread now hummed with the sounds of hammers and chisels, as homes and temples rose anew from the ashes. Lyra, now a symbol of resilience, took it upon herself to establish a new order, a brotherhood and sisterhood of guardians who would uphold the balance of time without the dangerous allure of the heart's power. This order was built on a simple yet profound principle: to protect the flow of time, not through domination, but through harmony and understanding. As the days turned into months, the tales of the Undying Keepers began to spread far and wide. Stories of their bravery, their sacrifices, and their unyielding commitment to the world's balance became a source of hope for countless souls. Parents told their children of Alara's journey, of how she faced impossible odds and emerged victorious, not for glory, but for the sake of all who would come after. These stories became a living testament to the power of unity and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Yet, for Alara, the journey was far from over. Though the heart of eternity was gone, its echoes lingered in the winds of time. She often found herself standing atop the city's highest tower, gazing out at the horizon, feeling a familiar presence in the breeze. It was Kael, her mentor, her friend, and the one who had shown her the true meaning of sacrifice. Though he was no longer by her side, she sensed him in the whispers of the air, a silent guardian, watching over the world he had fought so hard to protect. In those quiet moments, Alara found solace. She knew that while the path ahead would not be easy, it was one worth walking. The balance of time was a fragile thing, and the responsibility of maintaining it was immense. But she also knew she was not alone. The new order she had founded, the people of Aeloria, and the memories of those who had fallen, all of them were with her, guiding her steps as she moved forward into the unknown. The winds of time carried with them both the past and the promise of the future, and as Alara stood there, her gaze steady and her resolve unshaken, she knew that the legacy of the Undying Keepers would endure not as a tale of power, but as a testament to the enduring light of hope. The tale of the Undying Keepers is more than just a story. It's a timeless reminder of the weight of responsibility and the power of sacrifice. Through the ages, their legacy has echoed, a testament to those who stood against the chaos of fractured time. Alara, the last of her kind, embodies this enduring hope. With every step she takes, she carries the weight of Kael and Lyra's choices, their triumphs, and their ultimate sacrifice. Her journey is not just her own, it's a continuation of a promise made long ago, a vow to safeguard the fragile balance of existence. The heart of eternity, though lost, lingers as a symbol of both power and peril. Its absence serves as a warning, a reminder that some forces are too great to wield, too dangerous to control, and yet, its mystery also speaks to the enduring curiosity of mortals, the relentless drive to seek answers, even when the cost is unimaginable. The Keepers understood this temptation, and their story teaches us that true strength lies not in domination, but in restraint. In the quiet moments, when the world seems still, the whispers of the past can still be heard. They carry the voices of the Undying Keepers, their laughter, their sorrow, and their unyielding resolve. These whispers remind us that their duty was never truly finished. It's a burden passed from one generation to the next, a silent call to protect what matters most. Their stories, etched into the fabric of time, will never fade. They live on in the choices we make, the battles we fight, and the legacies we leave behind. So, as we reflect on the Undying Keepers, let their tale inspire us to honor our own responsibilities, no matter how daunting they may seem. For in the end, it's not the power we wield, but the sacrifices we make that define us. And like Alara, we too can carry forward the light of hope, ensuring that the echoes of the past guide us toward a brighter future.